In Oregon's Cascade foothills, a successful lawyer was about to face brutal family rejection. What started as a reunion took a shocking turn when she encountered 15 years of resentment. Cathy Blackwell wasn't your typical prodigal daughter. For over a decade, she had built her life fighting environmental cases in Seattle, known for her unwavering determination. When she encountered her hostile extended family at her grandmother's estate, she had no idea she was walking into an orchestrated ambush. Cathy's attempts at reconciliation would lead to explosive revelations. What began as awkward homecoming would become inheritance warfare. The estate would never recover after Cathy revealed a document shattering everything about belonging and betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Subaru's engine hummed a familiar tune as Cathy Blackwell navigated the winding mountain roads of the Oregon Cascades, each curve bringing her deeper into a landscape that felt both achingly familiar and utterly foreign. 15 years. 15 years since she'd driven this route, since she'd seen the towering Douglas firs that lined Highway 126, since she'd breathed air that wasn't filtered through Seattle's urban sprawl. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she passed the weathered sign for Cedar Creek, population 847, according to the faded numbers. Probably fewer now. Rural Oregon had been bleeding young people for decades, sending them off to Portland and Seattle and San Francisco, places where ambition could find purchase. Places like the one she'd built her life in. The guilt sat heavy in her chest, a weight she'd carried for so long it had become part of her breathing. 15 years since she'd been back to Nana's place. 5 years since the funeral she'd missed because of a case that couldn't wait, or so she'd told herself. The family had understood, hadn't they? Death was permanent, but justice had deadlines. Now driving toward the first family reunion since Nana's passing, Cathy wondered if understanding had curdled into something else entirely. The turnoff appeared suddenly, marked by the same crooked mailbox that had leaned at that precise angle since her childhood. Whitmore Estate, it read in faded letters, though half the family living there now had different names. The quarter-mile driveway stretched ahead, lined with maple trees that Nana had planted when Cathy was 10. They were massive now, their canopy creating a tunnel of green shadow that felt like entering another world. But something was wrong. Cathy slowed the car as she emerged from the tree line, her breath catching in her throat. The Victorian mansion still dominated the landscape, its wraparound porch and gingerbread trim as ornate as ever, but everything around it had changed. The barn where she'd spent countless summer afternoons was gone, leaving only a concrete foundation and scattered lumber. Construction equipment sat idle near what used to be the chicken coop, and fresh gravel paths led to structures she didn't recognize, modern prefab buildings that looked like permanent housing rather than temporary shelters. She parked near the main house, her city car looking out of place among the collection of pickup trucks and utility vehicles that filled the circular drive. As she sat there, engine cooling with metallic ticks, she counted at least 6 vehicles she didn't recognize. How many people were living here now? The front door opened before she could gather her courage to approach. Uncle Richard stepped onto the porch, his bulk filling the doorframe. He'd aged hard since she'd last seen him, deeper lines around his eyes, gray threading through his brown hair, and a paunch that spoke of too many beers and not enough physical labor. But his stance remained the same. Arms crossed, chin raised, the posture of a man who considered himself the authority on any situation. "Well, well," Richard's voice carried across the yard. "Look what the cat dragged in." Other faces appeared in windows and doorways. Aunt Linda's pale features behind the lace curtains of the front parlor. Jake emerging from one of the new buildings, work clothes dusty, expression carefully neutral. Emma stepping around the corner of the house, her teenage defiance written in every line of her body. Cathy forced herself to get out of the car, her legs unsteady after the 3-hour drive. "Hello, Richard? Everyone?" She managed a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "The place looks different. Things change when people stick around to take care of them." Linda's voice drifted from the porch, where she'd appeared beside her husband. She wore the same martyred expression Cathy remembered from childhood, but it was sharper now, honed by years of resentment. Some of us didn't have the luxury of running off to play lawyer in the big city. The words hit like a slap. Cathy's rehearsed pleasantries died in her throat. I didn't run off. I went to college. People do that. People come home too, Richard said, descending the porch steps with deliberate slowness. Especially when family needs them. Especially when the woman who raised them is dying. Dying. The word hung in the air like smoke. Cathy had known Nana was sick. Had known and had chosen to believe the reports that she was stable, comfortable, that there was time. Always time. I didn't know how bad it was, Cathy said quietly. She never said because she had pride. Linda interrupted, her voice rising. Pride and hope that maybe, just maybe, the granddaughter she sacrificed everything for might find her way home before it was too late. Emma shifted uncomfortably by the corner of the house, her dark eyes, so like Nana's, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Jake had stopped working entirely, leaning against a fence post with the careful stillness of someone trying to become invisible. I came as soon as I could for the funeral, Cathy said, hating how defensive she sounded. My flight was delayed, and then there was fog in Portland. There's always something, isn't there? Richard's smile was cold. Always some excuse why Seattle is more important than the people who actually matter. The unfairness of it stole Cathy's breath. She'd built a career, a life. She'd fought for environmental protections that saved the very forests that surrounded them. But standing here in the shadow of Nana's house, those accomplishments felt small and distant. I'm here now, she said finally, for the reunion, like the invitation said. Richard's laugh was harsh. The invitation. Right. Because that's what it takes to get you here. A formal invitation. Not family loyalty. Not love. Just legal obligation? What's that supposed to mean? But Richard was already turning away, dismissing her with the same casual cruelty he'd perfected in childhood. Come on, Linda. We've got real work to do. As they disappeared into the house, Cathy stood alone in the yard, surrounded by the ghosts of her memories and the reality of what the place had become. This wasn't the homecoming she'd imagined during the long drive. This was something else entirely, something that felt like an ambush. Jake approached slowly, his work boots crunching on the gravel. Up close, she could see he'd grown into his father's broad shoulders, but his eyes held a gentleness that Richard had never possessed. Don't let them get to you, he said quietly. They've been difficult since Nana passed. Difficult? Cathy looked around at the transformed landscape. Jake, what happened here? Where did all these buildings come from? And why is everyone living here? His jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the house where his parents had disappeared. It's complicated. Dad's been managing things since Nana got sick. Making improvements. Consolidating resources. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd given this explanation before. Consolidating resources, Cathy repeated. What does that mean? But Jake was already backing away, the same wariness she'd seen in his childhood creeping back into his expression. You should probably get settled. Mom put you in your old room upstairs. Dinner's at 6. He escaped toward the outbuildings before she could ask more questions, leaving her standing alone with her suitcase and a growing sense that she'd walked into something far more complex than a simple family gathering. As she climbed the porch steps, Cathy caught sight of movement in the front window. Emma watched her approach, her young face unreadable. When their eyes met, the girl's expression shifted, not to welcome, but to something that might have been curiosity, or calculation. The front door stood open, revealing the familiar hallway with its dark wood paneling and faded floral wallpaper. But even here, things felt different. The photographs that had lined the walls, pictures of Cathy's parents, of her graduation, of family gatherings from decades past, were gone, replaced by newer images of Richard's family. It was as if her history had been carefully edited out. Cathy climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, each step creaking with familiar protests. The room was exactly as she'd left it. Twin bed with the same blue quilt, desk by the window, bookshelf filled with high school literature assignments. But it felt like a museum display, preserved not out of love, but out of some other intention she couldn't name. She set her suitcase on the bed and moved to the window, looking out over the estate that had once felt like the center of the universe. The view had changed too. Where once there had been open pasture stretching to the tree line, now there were more of those prefab structures, satellite dishes, and what looked like a small industrial complex near the back of the property. What had happened here? And why did everyone seem to think it was somehow her fault? As the afternoon light slanted through the maple trees, casting long shadows across the transformed landscape, Cathy felt the first real stirring of something beyond guilt and confusion. It was anger, clean and sharp and surprisingly welcome. She'd spent 15 years building a life, pursuing a career that mattered, trying to make a difference in a world that needed it. She'd mourned Nana's death from afar, carried the guilt of missed opportunities and unspoken words. But she'd never imagined that her absence had been twisted into abandonment, her success transformed into betrayal. Whatever game her family was playing, whatever narrative they'd constructed to justify their resentment, she was going to figure it out. She owed Nana that much. She owed herself that much. The sound of voices drifted up from the kitchen below, Linda's sharp tones mixing with Richard's deeper rumble. They were discussing something with urgency, their words too muffled to understand, but their emotions clear enough. Cathy checked her watch. 3 hours until dinner. 3 hours to begin unraveling whatever truth lay beneath the surface of her family's hostility. She had a feeling she was going to need every minute. The dining room chandelier cast fractured light across the long mahogany table that had hosted 3 generations of Whitmore family meals. Cathy sat at what had once been her usual spot, though the chair felt foreign beneath her now, as if the wood itself had forgotten her shape. The formal place settings, Nana's good china with the delicate rose pattern, seemed to mock the tension that filled the room like smoke. 6 o'clock had arrived with military precision, and the family had assembled with the same grim determination soldiers might show before battle. Uncle Richard presided at the head of the table, carving a roast with deliberate, aggressive strokes. Aunt Linda sat to his right, her pale hands folded in prayer position, though her eyes held nothing resembling peace. Jake and Emma flanked their parents, both studying their plates as if the floral pattern might reveal escape routes. Cousin Beth had arrived just as dinner was called, her diplomatic smile already in place. She'd offered Cathy a careful hug, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances, and made appropriate noises about how wonderful it was to see her again. But even Beth's practiced courtesy couldn't mask the underlying current of discomfort that seemed to follow Cathy like a shadow. "Beautiful roast, Linda," Beth ventured, her voice artificially bright. "You always did have the magic touch with beef." Linda's smile was razor thin. "Well, when you're actually here to cook for your family, you learn to make do with what you have. Not all of us can afford to eat out every night in fancy Seattle restaurants." The barb hit its mark, and Cathy felt her cheeks burn. "I don't eat out every night. I cook plenty. Do you now?" Richard's voice cut through her protest. "Funny, Nana used to worry you weren't eating enough. Used to say how thin you looked in those Christmas cards you'd send instead of visiting." Christmas cards. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Cathy had sent those cards faithfully every year, along with photographs and updates about her life, her cases, her small victories in courtrooms far from home. She'd thought they were bridges, connections across the miles. Apparently, they'd been seen as insults. "I called regularly," Cathy said quietly. "Nana and I talked every week." Talked. Emma spoke for the first time since sitting down, her voice carrying the sharp edge of youth combined with something harder. "Right. For 10 minutes? Before you had to run off to some meeting or date or whatever was more important than the woman who raised you." The unfairness of it took Cathy's breath away. Those phone calls had been the highlight of her week, long conversations about everything and nothing. Nana's garden, the weather, Cathy's cases, memories from childhood. They'd lasted hours, not minutes. But looking around the table at the faces staring back at her, she realized that somewhere along the way, her version of events had been rewritten. "That's not how it was," she said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Isn't it?" Richard set down his carving knife with deliberate precision. "Let's see. 15 years since you've been home. 5 years since you bothered to show up for holidays. And when Nana was dying, actually dying, Cathy, where were you?" "I was working on the Riverside case. The logging company was trying to..." "The logging company." Richard's laugh was bitter. "Of course. Always some cause more important than the people who actually love you. Some trees that needed saving, while the woman who sacrificed everything for you was lying in a hospital bed, asking the nurses if today might be the day her granddaughter finally came home." The words hit like physical blows. Cathy gripped her water glass, using its coolness to anchor herself against the wave of guilt and confusion washing over her. "She never told me it was that bad. She said she was comfortable, that the treatment was working." She lied. Linda's voice was flat, matter of fact. "She lied because she loved you too much to guilt you into coming home. Because she thought, God help her, that you'd figure it out yourself. That blood would mean something. That the child she raised from 8 years old might feel some obligation to the woman who gave up everything to make sure you had a future." "I didn't know," Cathy whispered. "You didn't want to know," Emma shot back. "There's a difference. You could have visited. Could have seen for yourself instead of believing whatever made you feel better about staying away." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, shooting his sister a warning look, but Emma was just getting started. Her dark eyes, so much like Nana's that it made Cathy's chest ache, blazed with an anger that seemed too old for her 19 years. "Do you know what she did the week before she died?" Emma's voice grew stronger, more confident in her rage. "She made Dad drive her to town so she could buy you a graduation present. For law school. 7 years late, but she said it didn't matter because you were still her granddaughter and she was still proud of you. The present." Cathy remembered the package arriving 2 weeks after the funeral, a leather briefcase with her initials embossed in gold. She'd cried when she opened it, holding it against her chest as if she could somehow absorb the love that had gone into choosing it. It sat in her office now, used daily, a reminder of the woman who'd believed in her even when she'd failed to believe in herself. "She never stopped defending you," Jake said quietly, speaking for the first time since grace had been said. "Every family gathering, every time someone would mention how long you'd been gone, she'd make excuses. Say you were busy saving the world, making a difference. Say you'd come home when you could. But you never did." Richard's voice was heavy with finality. "Not once. Not for birthdays, or holidays, or anniversaries. Not when Linda's mother died and the whole family came together. Not when Jake graduated high school with honors, or when Emma won that scholarship that she couldn't take because we couldn't afford the rest of the tuition." Each example was a stone thrown at glass, shattering Cathy's carefully constructed understanding of her own choices. She'd sent money for the funeral flowers, for Jake's graduation gift, for Emma's scholarship fund. She'd thought that was enough, that her contributions from afar were appreciated, understood. "I sent," she began. "Money." Linda's voice dripped with contempt. "You sent money. Like we were some charity case you could clear your conscience with by writing a check. That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her with the cold calculation of a man who'd found his target. 15 years, Cathy. 15 years of excuses and apologies and promises you never kept. 15 years of us taking care of everything here while you played house in your fancy Seattle apartment. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Nana's grandfather clock in the corner. Cathy looked around the table at faces that had once been filled with love, searching for some hint of the warmth she remembered from childhood. But all she saw was resentment, carefully nurtured and perfectly preserved. "I built a life," she said finally. I thought that's what she wanted for me. She wanted you to remember where you came from, Linda said. She wanted you to understand that success means nothing if you abandon the people who made it possible. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the table, the family that had once been her whole world stared at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. Even Beth, usually the peacemaker, looked uncomfortable, her diplomatic mask slipping to reveal something that might have been pity. Linda's next words came out in a rush, as if they'd been building pressure for years and could no longer be contained. You don't belong here anymore, Cathy. You made that choice 15 years ago when you decided that being a Whitmore wasn't good enough for you. When you decided that this place, these people, weren't worth your precious time. The declaration hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from Cathy's lungs. She stared at Linda's face, flushed with righteous anger, eyes bright with unshed tears, and realized that this wasn't just disappointment. This was grief. They were grieving her as if she'd died, as if the Cathy who'd grown up in this house had been murdered by the woman who'd taken her place. You don't mean that, she whispered. I do. Linda's voice was steady now, certain. I absolutely do. You abandoned this family. You abandoned Nana. And now you come waltzing back in here with your designer clothes and your city car, expecting us to welcome you with open arms? Expecting us to pretend that the last 15 years never happened? Cathy pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like breaking bone. The faces around the table watched her with varying degrees of satisfaction and discomfort, but none of them moved to stop her retreat. I need some air, she managed, her voice barely audible. She stumbled from the dining room, through the front hall where her ancestors' portraits watched with painted disapproval, and up the stairs to her childhood bedroom. Her hands shook as she closed the door behind her, leaning against it as if the thin wood could somehow protect her from the truth of what had just happened. They were right. God help her, they were right about so many things. She had stayed away, had made excuses, had chosen her career over family obligations again and again. But she'd never meant it as abandonment. She'd thought her purse sat on the dresser where she'd left it earlier. Inside, tucked behind her driver's license in a pocket she rarely opened, was a document she'd forgotten she carried. Something Tom Bradley had given her 5 years ago at Nana's funeral. Pressed into her hands with urgent whispers about reading it carefully, about understanding its implications. She'd been too grief-stricken then to process his words, too overwhelmed by guilt and loss to do anything but nod and tuck the envelope away. She'd meant to look at it later, when the pain wasn't so fresh. But later had become weeks, then months, then years, and the envelope had remained unopened, forgotten in the chaos of her daily life. Now, with Linda's words echoing in her ears, and her family's rejection burning in her chest, Cathy pulled out the envelope with fingers that trembled only slightly. Whatever was inside couldn't make things worse than they already were. The property deed felt heavier than paper should, its legal language dense and formal. But two things were crystal clear: the date of execution, 3 days before Nana's death, and the name of the sole inheritor, Catherine Elizabeth Blackwell. Everything. The house, the land, the outbuildings, the mineral rights. All of it. Every acre of the 40-acre estate that the Whitmore family had called home for 3 generations belonged to her. Cathy stared at the document until the words blurred, her mind struggling to process the implications. If this was real, and Tom Bradley's name on the witness line suggested it was, then everything she'd just witnessed downstairs was built on a lie. A lie so complete and so carefully maintained that even she had believed it. Cathy's hand trembled as she folded the deed and slipped it into her back pocket. The paper felt like it was burning against her skin, its implications too enormous to fully grasp. Downstairs, she could hear the murmur of voices. Her family continuing their dinner as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just systematically dismantled 15 years of her life choices. She moved to the window, looking out at the estate that apparently belonged to her. The prefab buildings, the construction equipment, the vehicles she didn't recognize, All of it sat on land that bore her name on a legal document. The contradiction made her head spin. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her hair and straightened her shoulders. Whatever was happening here, whatever game was being played, it was time to change the rules. The dining room fell silent as she appeared in the doorway. Richard was mid-sentence, something about property taxes and maintenance costs, but his words died as he noticed her return. The others looked up from their dessert plates. Linda's famous apple pie, served on the same china that had graced this table for decades. Feeling better? Beth asked carefully, her diplomatic instincts kicking in. Maybe you just needed a moment to... I'm fine, Cathy said quietly. She walked to her abandoned chair but didn't sit down. Instead, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded document. Actually, I wanted to share something with everyone. The paper made a soft rustling sound as she unfolded it. The only noise in the suddenly tense room. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. A piece of pie balanced precariously on its edge. Without ceremony, Cathy placed the deed in the center of the table, its official letterhead and legal seals clearly visible. The document landed between the water pitcher and the serving platter with the finality of a gavel. What is that? Linda's voice was barely above a whisper. The property deed for this estate, Cathy said, her voice steadier than she felt. Dated 3 days before Nana's death, witnessed by Tom Bradley and notarized by Sarah Chen at the county courthouse. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the document's header. Jake went completely still, his face draining of color. Beth's diplomatic mask slipped entirely, revealing naked shock. But it was Richard's reaction that told Cathy everything she needed to know. His face cycled through emotions like a broken slideshow: confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally a desperate kind of anger that made his hands shake. That's impossible, he said, his voice rough. This has to be some kind of mistake. It's not a mistake. Cathy's words cut through his denial. My name is right there. Catherine Elizabeth Blackwell, sole inheritor of the entire Whitmore estate. 40 acres, mineral rights, all structures and improvements. Emma snatched up the document before her father could stop her, her 19-year-old eyes sharp enough to parse the legal language. Holy shit, she breathed, then caught herself. Sorry, but, Dad, this says Cathy owns everything. The house, the land, all of it. That's impossible, Richard repeated, but his voice had lost its authority. He reached for the deed with hands that visibly trembled. Nana would have told us. She would have discussed something this important with the family. Would she? Cathy's question hung in the air like smoke. Because from what I heard tonight, she was a woman who kept her own counsel, who made excuses for people she loved, who lied to protect others' feelings. Jake finally found his voice. You didn't know? His question was directed at Cathy, his tone carefully neutral. You've been carrying this document for 5 years, and you didn't know what it said? The admission felt like another failure, but Cathy forced herself to meet his eyes. Tom Bradley gave it to me at the funeral. I wasn't in any condition to read legal documents that day. I put it away and forgot about it. Convenient. Linda's voice dripped with sarcasm, but there was something else there now. Fear. Very convenient that you suddenly remember you have it right after we tell you the truth about your selfishness. The truth? Cathy's composure finally cracked. What truth is that, Linda? That I abandoned the family? That I don't belong here? Because this document suggests that Nana had a very different opinion about my place in this family. Richard was studying the deed now, his construction-roughened fingers tracing the legal seals as if he could somehow wish them away. This has to be a forgery. Has to be. Nana was sick, confused. Someone could have taken advantage. Are you suggesting I forged a legal document? Cathy's voice was dangerously quiet. Because that's a serious accusation, Richard. The kind that could involve criminal charges. I'm suggesting, Richard said, his voice growing louder, that there are people in this world who prey on confused old women. People who might convince a sick woman to sign documents she doesn't understand. The accusation hit like a slap. Around the table, she could see the family processing Richard's words, watching their faces as they decided whether to believe in her guilt or their own complicity in something larger. So in your version of events, Cathy said slowly, I somehow convinced Nana to leave me everything without any of you knowing about it. Despite the fact that I hadn't visited in 15 years. Despite the fact that, according to you, she was disappointed in me and making excuses for my absence. Stranger things have happened, Linda said, but her voice lacked conviction. Emma, still holding the deed, looked up from the legal language with eyes that had suddenly grown much older. Dad, she said quietly, if Cathy owns the property, what does that mean for us? For the houses you built? For Jake's farming operation? The question hung in the air like a blade. Richard's face flushed red, then white, as the implications hit home. All the construction, all the improvements, all the family members who had moved onto the property over the past 5 years. It had all been done without the legal owner's permission. It means, Cathy said quietly, that I need some explanations. Starting with why you all seem to think you had the right to make decisions about property that wasn't yours. Jake pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. I need some air, he muttered, echoing Cathy's earlier escape. But unlike her retreat, his felt like a strategic withdrawal, the movement of someone who suddenly understood that the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. Jake. Richard's voice was sharp with authority. Sit down. We're going to figure this out as a family. But Jake was already at the doorway, his broad shoulders tense with some emotion Cathy couldn't name. Are we? He asked without turning around. Because it sounds like maybe we've been figuring things out without all the relevant information. He disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before. Where earlier the quiet had been accusatory, now it carried the weight of exposure, of secrets suddenly dragged into light. Beth cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps, she said in her diplomat's voice, we should contact Tom Bradley. Get his perspective on the document's authenticity and implications. It's Saturday night, Linda said quickly. Too late to bother him with legal questions. Is it? Cathy pulled out her phone. Because this seems like the kind of situation that warrants an emergency call. After all, if there's been some mistake, some confusion about the property ownership, we should clear it up immediately. She watched their faces as she scrolled through her contacts, noting how Richard's jaw tightened, how Linda's hands clenched in her lap, how Emma continued staring at the deed, as if it might change if she looked hard enough. Unless, Cathy said quietly, there's something else you need to tell me first. Something about what's been happening here since Nana died. Something that might explain why the idea of calling the family lawyer makes everyone look like they've seen a ghost. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 times, marking the passage of time in a room where everything had suddenly, irrevocably changed. And in that silence, Cathy began to understand that the weekend she dreaded was about to become something far more complicated than a simple family reunion. It was about to become a reckoning. Dawn crept through the lace curtains of Cathy's childhood bedroom, painting everything in shades of gray that matched her mood. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of the previous night's revelation. The deed lay on her nightstand like evidence at a crime scene, its legal language more damning in the morning light. Downstairs, she could hear movement, hushed voices, the scrape of chairs, the urgent whisper of a family in crisis. They'd scattered after dinner like birds from a gunshot, but clearly they'd regrouped. Planning. Strategizing. Probably trying to figure out how to contain the damage she'd unleashed. Cathy dressed quietly and slipped down the back stairs, the same route she'd used as a child when she wanted to avoid detection. The kitchen was empty, coffee still warm in the pot, but voices drifted from Nana's study, the small room off the main hallway where her grandmother had kept the estate's business records. The door was cracked open, and through it she could see Richard hunched over the desk, papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and even from a distance she could see the desperate edge to his movements as he rifled through filing cabinets. Find anything? Linda's voice was tight with anxiety. Nothing that helps, Richard muttered. Every document here supports that damn deed. Property transfers, tax records, insurance policies. All of it shows Nana as the sole owner right up until her death. Cathy pressed closer to the door, her heart hammering as the magnitude of the situation became clear. They weren't just surprised by the deed's existence. They were panicked by it. What about the power of attorney? This from Emma, her young voice carrying a calculation that made Cathy's stomach turn. You had legal authority to make decisions for her those last few months. Financial decisions, Richard said sharply, not property transfers. And certainly not a complete disinheritance of the family. Cathy's breath caught. Disinheritance. They'd expected to inherit, had planned on it, built their lives around that assumption. Maybe Tom made a mistake, Linda suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe he misunderstood her intentions. Richard's laugh was bitter. Tom Bradley doesn't make mistakes. He's been doing estate law for 30 years. If he witnessed that deed, it's because Nana specifically requested it. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Cathy scrambling back toward the kitchen, but not before she caught Richard's next words. We need to call him. Find out exactly what she told him about her reasons. Cathy poured herself coffee with hands that only trembled slightly, processing what she'd overheard. The family hadn't just assumed they would inherit. They'd been acting on that assumption for years. The construction, the permanent residences, the way they'd spoken about managing the property, it all made sense now. They'd been living as if they owned the place because they'd believed they did. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Tom Bradley, responding to the voicemail she'd left the night before. Available to talk this morning. Can meet at my office at 9 a.m., if convenient. At 9 sharp, Cathy sat across from Tom Bradley's cluttered desk, the deeds spread between them, like a map to buried treasure. The lawyer looked older than she remembered from the funeral, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but his gaze was sharp and focused. You really didn't read this when I gave it to you? He asked, not unkindly. I couldn't process much of anything that day, Cathy admitted. I thought it was just paperwork. Insurance documents or something routine. Tom nodded, understanding. Eleanor was very specific about the timing. She wanted you to have it immediately after the service, but she also knew you'd be in no condition to act on it right away. She hoped the family would handle things appropriately in the interim. Handle things how? By recognizing that they were caretakers, not owners. By making decisions that would benefit the property and honor her memory while waiting for you to claim your inheritance. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Tom, what did she tell you about her reasons? Why me and not the family members who were actually here? The lawyer leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Eleanor was a sharp woman, even in her final months. She'd been watching the family dynamics for years, especially after Richard's business failed, and he moved his family onto the property. She saw how they treated you, how they spoke about your choices, your career. What do you mean? She heard them, Cathy. The comments about you being too good for the family, the resentment about your success, the way they blamed you for pursuing opportunities they envied. She also saw the financial desperation, the pressure they put on her to sign over property rights. Cathy's stomach dropped. They asked her to transfer ownership? Multiple times. Richard presented it as practical, tax benefits, estate planning, making sure the property stayed in family hands. But Eleanor saw it for what it was, an attempt to claim inheritance before death, to cut you out entirely. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that made Cathy feel sick. So she protected my interests by naming me sole heir. She protected the property by leaving it to the one person who'd never asked her for anything, who'd built a life without expecting handouts, who understood the value of independence. Tom pulled out another folder, this one thick with correspondence. There's more you need to know. After Eleanor's death, the family told me you'd relinquished your claim to the property, said you wanted nothing to do with it, that you preferred they handle everything. The room spun slightly. That's not true. I never said any such thing. I know. I asked for written documentation of your relinquishment, and they kept promising to provide it. When months passed without any paperwork, I became suspicious. That's why I tried to reach you several times last year. Cathy's mind raced through her voicemails, trying to remember calls from Tom's office. There had been a few, she thought, but she'd been in the middle of a major case and had assumed they were routine follow-ups about probate details. The property has been generating income, Tom continued. Timber sales, mineral rights leasing, agricultural contracts. By law, that money belongs to you, but it's been going to Richard, who claimed authority as your designated representative. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. How much money are we talking about? Tom consulted his files. Approximately $43,000 over the past 5 years. Plus the value of the improvements they've made using estate funds, the prefab buildings, the equipment purchases, the utilities installations. $43,000. Money that belonged to her, used to fund a life she'd been excluded from, to build structures on land she owned without her knowledge or consent. Tom, she said quietly, I think my family has been lying to me for years, and I think they've been lying to you, too. The lawyer's expression was grim, but unsurprised. What do you want to do about it? Cathy thought about the family gathering for breakfast back at the estate, probably still strategizing about how to handle her inconvenient existence. Thought about 15 years of guilt and self-doubt, of accepting blame for choices that now seemed less selfish and more necessary than ever. I want the truth, she said finally. All of it. And then I want to decide what kind of justice looks like. Cathy found Mrs. Johnson exactly where she'd expected, kneeling among the rose bushes in Nana's garden, her weathered hands gentle against the thorny stems. The older woman looked up as Cathy approached, her kind eyes immediately reading the turmoil written across her face. I wondered when you'd come looking for me, Mrs. Johnson said softly, rising from the dirt with practiced ease. Figured it was only a matter of time before the truth started coming out. You knew? Cathy's voice cracked slightly. About the deed? About what's been happening? Mrs. Johnson's expression was sad but unsurprised. Child, I knew your grandmother for 20 years. Watched her make that decision. Watched her agonize over it. Watched her hope the family would do right by you after she was gone. Her voice grew bitter. Should have known better. She brushed soil from her hands and gestured toward a wooden bench nestled between the climbing roses, Nana's favorite spot for morning coffee. Sit with me. There's plenty you need to hear, and it's past time someone told you the whole truth about why Eleanor Whitmore loved you more than her own blood. Cathy was still sitting in the garden with Mrs. Johnson when she heard the familiar rumble of David's hybrid SUV coming up the drive. She'd forgotten he was supposed to arrive today, forgotten about everything beyond the swirling revelations that had upended her understanding of the past 5 years. Now, watching him emerge from his vehicle with that careful lawyer's assessment of unfamiliar territory, she felt a rush of relief so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes. David Miller moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly and accurately. Even from a distance, Cathy could see him taking in the scene, the construction equipment, the prefab buildings, the collection of vehicles that suggested a much larger gathering than the simple family reunion he'd been expecting. His dark eyes found her in the garden, and she saw his expression shift from casual interest to sharp concern. That your young man? Mrs. Johnson asked, following Cathy's gaze. Good timing. You're going to need someone in your corner who doesn't have 20 years of family baggage clouding their judgment. Cathy excused herself and walked toward the main house, intercepting David before he could encounter the family members who were undoubtedly watching his arrival with as much interest as she was. He met her halfway across the lawn, his hands immediately reaching for hers, a gesture of connection that felt like an anchor in a storm. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said quietly, his attorney's eyes already cataloging the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her face. What's happened? More than I can explain standing here, she said, glancing toward the house where she could see faces in the windows. Can we walk? I need to fill you in before you meet everyone. They took the path toward the back of the property, past the new structures that had so surprised her upon arrival. David listened without interruption as she laid out the previous day's events. The hostile reception, the devastating dinner conversation, the deed that had changed everything. Her morning revelation with Tom Bradley about the scope of the family's deception. Jesus, Cathy. David stopped walking and turned to face her fully. You're telling me they've been living on property they don't own, collecting income that belongs to you, and telling everyone, including the estate attorney, that you'd abandoned your inheritance? That's exactly what I'm telling you. The words felt surreal even as she spoke them. David, I own this entire estate. 40 acres, every building, every improvement they've made over the past 5 years. And they've been acting like I don't exist. David's mind was already working through the legal implications. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze swept the property with new understanding. The improvements alone probably represent significant value. If they used estate funds or income from your property to build those structures. Tom says there's been over $40,000 in income from timber and mineral rights. Money that should have come to me but went to Uncle Richard instead. Based on their fraudulent claim that you'd relinquished your rights. David's voice carried the controlled anger of a lawyer who'd encountered too many cases of family financial abuse. Cathy, this isn't just deception. Depending on how it was structured, this could be criminal fraud. They'd reached the edge of the cultivated property, where the manicured lawn gave way to the Douglas fir forest that stretched toward the mountains. The silence here was profound, broken only by bird calls and the distant sound of wind in the treetops. It was the kind of peace Cathy had always associated with this place, but now it felt fragile, threatened by the human drama playing out in the shadow of the Victorian mansion. There's something else, she said. Mrs. Johnson, Nana's former housekeeper. She has letters. Documents that Nana left specifically for me, explaining her decision-making process. Apparently she'd been watching the family's behavior for years, saw how they treated me, how they pressured her for money and property rights. David's expression grew grimmer. Financial elder abuse. If your grandmother felt pressured to make financial decisions based on family coercion, but she didn't cave to the pressure. That's the thing. She deliberately chose to leave everything to me, knowing it would upset them, because she saw me as the only family member with integrity. And now you're faced with a choice about what to do with that trust. The weight of it settled on Cathy's shoulders like a physical burden. David, these people raised me. Uncle Richard taught me to drive. Aunt Linda made my birthday cakes every year until I left for college. Jake and Emma are like siblings to me, or they were. How do I destroy their lives over money and property? Is that what you'd be doing? David's question was gentle but probing. Or would you be holding them accountable for 5 years of lies and fraud? They walked in silence for several minutes, following a deer path that Cathy remembered from childhood explorations. The familiar landscape felt different now, not just nostalgic, but somehow more substantial. She owned this. Every tree, every rock outcropping, every childhood memory embedded in the trails and hidden clearings. What would you do? She asked finally. David considered the question with the thoroughness she'd always admired in his legal thinking. I'd want to understand their perspective first, why they felt entitled to make decisions without consulting you, whether this was desperation or calculated greed, whether they're willing to acknowledge what they've done and make it right, and if they're not, then you'd have to decide whether preserving family relationships is worth enabling their behavior. Whether the message you want to send is that love means never having to face consequences for betrayal. The words hit harder than he'd probably intended. Cathy thought about the dinner conversation, the casual cruelty with which they'd dismissed her life choices, the way they'd weaponized guilt to justify their own sense of entitlement. They made me feel like I was the one who'd failed, she said quietly. Like I was selfish for building a career, ungrateful for not coming home more often. They rewrote history to make themselves the victims of my success. Classic manipulation technique, David said. Make the target feel guilty for the manipulator's choices. It's emotional abuse, Cathy, even if they don't recognize it as such. As they walked back toward the house, Cathy felt something shifting inside her. The same sensation she'd experienced in court when a case suddenly became clear, when the right strategy revealed itself through the chaos of competing narratives. She'd spent 15 years accepting blame for choices that now seemed not just reasonable but necessary. She'd built a life of meaning and purpose while her family had built a narrative of abandonment to justify their own decisions. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time to have a very different kind of family conversation." David squeezed her hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm here." "But Cathy, don't let guilt make this decision for you. You've carried that burden long enough." The house loomed ahead of them, its Victorian elegance hiding the dysfunction that had flourished in her absence. But for the first time since arriving, Cathy felt ready to face whatever came next. She had allies now: Tom Bradley with his legal documentation, Mrs. Johnson with her eyewitness testimony, and David with his clear-eyed perspective on the situation. Most importantly, she had the truth. And the truth, she was beginning to realize, was worth fighting for. The living room felt smaller with everyone assembled, the tension thick enough to cut. Cathy had called the meeting for 2 o'clock, giving the family time to digest David's arrival and her morning absence. Now they sat arranged like opposing armies, Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda on the main sofa, Jake and Emma flanking them in wingback chairs, Cousin Beth perched nervously on the piano bench. David stood beside Cathy near the fireplace, his presence a quiet reminder that this was no longer just a family matter. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation," Cathy began, her voice steadier than she felt. "About the property, about the past 5 years, and about what happens next." Richard's jaw was already set in defensive lines. "If this is about that deed, it's about fraud." The word landed like a bomb in the quiet room. "It's about telling Tom Bradley I'd relinquished my inheritance when I'd done no such thing. It's about collecting $43,000 in property income that legally belongs to me. It's about making improvements to land you don't own without the owner's permission." Linda's face flushed red. "We've been taking care of this place, maintaining it, improving it, keeping Nana's memory alive while you couldn't be bothered to, with my money." Cathy's voice cut through the protest. "Using income from timber sales and mineral rights that belong to me, building structures on land that belongs to me, all while telling everyone I'd abandoned my claim." Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We didn't know about the deed. Dad said Nana had promised the property would stay in the family, that you didn't want it." "I never said I didn't want it because no one ever asked me." Cathy's gaze swept the room. "Instead, you created a narrative where I was the selfish one who'd turned her back on family. You made me feel guilty for building a life while you were literally stealing mine." "Stealing?" Richard shot to his feet, his face dark with anger. "We saved this place. When Nana died, it would have sat empty, rotting. We brought it back to life, made it productive again." "You made it profitable," David interjected quietly. "There's a difference. And you did it using resources that belonged to your niece without her knowledge or consent." "Who the hell are you to judge us?" Richard rounded on David. "You don't know what we sacrificed, what we gave up to keep this family together." "I know what the legal documents say." David's voice remained calm. "I know what constitutes fraud under Oregon law. And I know that good intentions don't excuse illegal actions." The room erupted in voices, Linda's emotional protests, Emma's sharp questions, Jake's attempts at mediation. But through the chaos, Cathy heard something else. The sound of a family finally forced to confront the lies they'd been telling themselves. Enough. Her voice, when she raised it, carried an authority none of them had heard before. "Here's what's going to happen. Tom Bradley is preparing documentation of every financial transaction related to this property over the past 5 years. Every dollar of income, every improvement, every decision made without my knowledge. Then we're going to decide what justice looks like." The silence that followed was deafening. And in that silence, Cathy realized that the scared, guilty young woman who'd arrived yesterday was gone. In her place stood someone who finally understood the difference between family loyalty and family fraud. The house settled into an uneasy quiet after the confrontation, family members scattering like survivors of a shipwreck. Cathy stood at the living room window watching Jake disappear into one of the prefab buildings, while Emma stalked toward the tree line, her anger radiating with each step. The weight of what came next pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. David had gone to make coffee, giving her space to process the magnitude of the moment. She owned everything these people called home, and they'd just learned that their entire living situation hung by the thread of her goodwill. Goodwill they'd spent 15 years systematically destroying. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Jake stood in the doorway, his work boots scuffed, his expression carefully neutral in a way that reminded her painfully of his childhood habit of hiding emotions behind politeness. "Can we talk?" His voice carried the weight of 23 years and a lifetime of family loyalty. "Just us." They walked to the old oak tree where they'd built a treehouse as children, now weathered and listing but still standing. Jake settled against the trunk with the easy grace of someone who belonged in this landscape, while Cathy perched on an exposed root, suddenly feeling like the intruder her family had accused her of being. "I knew," Jake said quietly. "Not about the deed specifically, but I knew something wasn't right. The way Dad talked about the property, the decisions he made without consulting anyone, it never felt legitimate." "Why didn't you say anything?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "To who?" "You were gone." Tom Bradley accepted Dad's authority, and when I questioned him directly, he'd get this look. He shrugged, but she could see the old fear in his eyes. "Dad doesn't handle challenges well. Never has." "What about the money? The income from timber sales?" "I thought it was going into some kind of family trust. Dad said it was for maintenance, improvements, Emma's education fund." Jake's voice grew quieter. "I worked those timber contracts personally. Oversaw the selective cutting, made sure we weren't damaging the forest ecosystem. I thought I was protecting Nana's legacy." The pain in his voice was genuine, and Cathy felt her anger shifting into something more complex. "Jake, what do you want from all this? If you could wave a magic wand and fix everything, what would it look like?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for years. "I want to earn my place here. Not because I'm family, not because Dad says I deserve it, but because I actually contribute something valuable. I want Emma to go to college without it being charity. And I want..." He paused, struggling with something deeper. "I want to stop feeling ashamed of my parents." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Cathy found herself thinking about the Jake she'd known as a child. Honest, gentle, always trying to make peace between stronger personalities. That boy was still there, trapped inside a man who'd been forced to choose between integrity and survival. "I could use a farm manager," she said carefully. "Someone who understands sustainable agriculture, who knows the land. Someone I could trust to make decisions that honor both the property's potential and its history." Jake's head snapped up, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "You'd do that? After everything?" "I'd do that for the right person. Someone willing to acknowledge what's been wrong and work to make it right." Before Jake could respond, Emma's voice cut through the afternoon air, sharp with distress. "Dad's on the phone with someone about lawyers. He's talking about contesting the deed, claiming Nana wasn't competent when she signed it." The fragile possibility of reconciliation shattered like glass. Cathy stood, her body moving with the decisive energy that had served her well in Seattle courtrooms. If Richard wanted a legal battle, she'd give him one. But this time she'd be fighting with the full weight of truth and law on her side. "Jake," she said quietly, "you're going to have to choose. Your parents' version of loyalty, or something that actually resembles justice." His answer would determine not just his future, but the kind of family legacy she'd be willing to build from the ashes of what had come before. Cathy sat in Nana's study at 3 a.m, surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and the weight of a decision that would reshape multiple lives. David had fallen asleep hours ago on the living room couch, exhausted by a day of phone calls with Tom Bradley and careful review of estate law. The house around her was silent, but she could feel the tension thrumming through its walls like electricity. On the desk before her lay 3 different paths, each one typed out in David's precise legal language. Option 1, full enforcement of her legal rights, eviction of all unauthorized residents, and criminal prosecution for fraud. Option 2. A negotiated settlement that would allow some family members to remain under strict legal agreements, while others faced consequences for their deception. Option 3. Forgiveness. A clean slate that would essentially reward 15 years of lies with continued access to property that wasn't theirs. She'd been staring at these options for hours, but the decision had crystallized during her conversation with Jake. Not because of what he'd said, but because of what she'd felt watching him wrestle with the impossible choice between family loyalty and moral courage. She'd spent too many years making that same choice, always choosing loyalty, always swallowing her own needs to preserve relationships that were built on manipulation rather than love. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted her thoughts. Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, her young face etched with something that looked like defeat. "Couldn't sleep either?" Emma asked, settling into the wingback chair across from the desk. "Too much to think about." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her gaze taking in the scattered documents. "Dad's been on the phone with 3 different lawyers. He's convinced he can prove Nana wasn't in her right mind when she signed that deed." "And what do you think?" "I think Nana was the sharpest person I ever knew, right up until the day she died." Emma's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "I think she saw exactly what Dad was doing and made sure you'd have the power to stop it." The admission hung in the air between them. Cathy studied Emma's face, seeing past the teenage defiance to something deeper. A young woman who'd been forced to watch her parents' moral compromises and had finally reached her breaking point. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The money your parents claimed was for your education fund. Did you ever see any of it?" Emma's laugh was bitter. "Education fund? They told me we couldn't afford college. Said I'd have to take out loans, maybe go to community college first. Meanwhile, Dad's been buying new equipment, Linda's been redecorating her house, and they've been taking weekend trips to Portland." Her voice grew quieter. "I applied for scholarships in secret. Got a full ride to Oregon State for environmental science. Want to know why I chose that major?" Cathy waited. "Because of you. Because even though everyone here acted like you were the selfish one, I could see what you'd actually built. A career that mattered. A life where you didn't have to depend on other people's money or guilt to survive." The words hit Cathy like a physical blow. All these years, she'd believed the family narrative about her selfishness, had carried guilt for choosing her own path. But Emma had been watching, learning, seeing through the lies to understand what independence actually looked like. "There's something else," Emma continued. "The night before you arrived, I heard Mom and Dad fighting. Dad said if you came back and started asking questions, they could lose everything. Mom said maybe it would be better to tell you the truth, try to work something out. Dad said absolutely not, that you'd already proven you didn't care about family, so they didn't owe you anything." The conversation Emma described confirmed what Cathy had already suspected. This wasn't desperation or misunderstanding. It was calculated deception, maintained for years with full knowledge of its illegality. "What do you want, Emma? If I asked you to design a fair outcome, what would it look like?" Emma straightened in her chair, her expression growing more adult than her 19 years should have allowed. "I want my parents to face consequences for what they've done. Not because I don't love them, but because someone needs to show them that actions have results. I want Jake to have a chance to prove he's better than they are. And I want to go to college knowing I earned my place there, not because it was paid for with stolen money." The clarity of Emma's response crystallized something in Cathy's mind. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about establishing a new foundation, one built on honesty, accountability, and earned trust, rather than blood relations and emotional manipulation. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. Not a legal document this time, but a letter. A statement of intention that would serve as the framework for everything that came next. "To the Whitmore family, 15 years ago, I left this place believing I was choosing my future over my past. I now understand I was choosing integrity over complicity in a family dynamic that was toxic, long before I had the courage to name it. The property deed makes my legal rights clear, but legal rights and moral choices aren't always the same thing. I've spent the past 3 days deciding not what I can do, but what I should do. Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda, your fraud will be reported to the appropriate authorities. The money you've taken will be repaid, with interest. You have 30 days to vacate the property and remove any belongings you can prove ownership of. Any legal challenge to this decision will result in full criminal prosecution. Jake, you've demonstrated integrity and remorse. If you're willing to sign a legal agreement acknowledging past wrongs and committing to transparency going forward, I'm prepared to offer you employment as farm manager, with the opportunity to earn equity in the farming operation over time. Emma, your college education will be funded through a trust that can't be touched by your parents. This isn't charity. It's an investment in the kind of person you've shown yourself to be. Beth and other family members, you're welcome on this property when you're ready to build relationships based on honesty rather than obligation. This isn't punishment for the sake of revenge. It's accountability for the sake of healing. Some relationships can't be repaired, but they can be replaced with something better. The Whitmore estate will remain in family hands, but it will belong to the family we choose to become, not the one we inherited. As dawn broke over the Oregon mountains, Cathy sealed the letter and left it on the kitchen table, where everyone would find it at breakfast. Then she walked out to the garden, where Mrs. Johnson was already tending Nana's roses, ready to begin the work of building something new from the ashes of what had come before. The hardest decisions, she'd learned, weren't between right and wrong. They were between what was comfortable and what was necessary. And for the first time in 15 years, she'd chosen what was necessary. Cathy's rental car crunched over the familiar gravel drive, but everything else had changed. The construction equipment was gone, replaced by neat vegetable gardens and a small greenhouse that gleamed in the October afternoon sun. The prefab buildings that had looked so out of place in August now seemed purposeful, integrated into the landscape by careful landscaping and fresh paint that complemented the Victorian mansion's color scheme. She parked in her usual spot and sat for a moment, taking in the transformation. Smoke rose from the main house's chimney, and she could see warm light glowing through the windows, the kind of welcome that felt genuine rather than obligatory. David emerged from the front door before she could gather her bags, his smile broad and unreserved. "How does it look?" he asked, pulling her into an embrace that smelled like wood smoke and coffee. "Like home," she said, and meant it. They'd spent the past 3 months shuttling between Seattle and the estate, David coordinating the legal aspects of the transition, while Cathy managed her caseload remotely. It had been exhausting, complicated, and occasionally heartbreaking. But standing here now, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from difficult work done well. Jake appeared around the corner of the house, his face lit with the kind of contentment she'd never seen in him during childhood. His jeans were dirt-stained from honest work, and his smile held none of the careful wariness that had defined their relationship for so many years. "Wait until you see the harvest numbers," he said, bouncing slightly on his toes like an excited kid. "The sustainable rotation system is working even better than we projected. And the timber management plan you approved? We've got 3 logging companies bidding on the selective cutting contracts." "Show me," Cathy said, and meant it. They walked the property for an hour, Jake pointing out improvements and explaining decisions with the passionate expertise of someone who'd finally found his calling. The farming operation was thriving under his management, but more importantly, he'd found ways to balance productivity with environmental stewardship that honored both Nana's legacy and Cathy's values. "Emma's been helping with the soil management research," Jake said as they approached the greenhouse. "She's designing her senior project around the carbon sequestration potential of our rotation system." Through the glass walls, Cathy could see Emma bent over a microscope, her dark hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail Nana had always worn for garden work. She looked up as they entered, her face breaking into the kind of unself-conscious grin that reminded Cathy why she'd fallen in love with this family in the first place. "Cathy!" Perfect timing. "I wanted to show you the soil samples from the North Pasture. The mycorrhizal networks are incredible. Much more robust than I expected for land that was conventionally farmed for so long." Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, her intelligence sharp and focused in ways that formal education was already shaping into something formidable. She'd started at Oregon State in September, with a double major in environmental science and sustainable agriculture, coming home weekends to continue her research and help Jake with the farm management. "How are your parents adjusting?" Cathy asked carefully. It was a question she'd avoided for months, but one that needed asking. Emma's expression grew more serious, but not bitter. "It's hard. Dad's still angry, still talks about lawyers and property rights when he's been drinking. But they're both working now. Real jobs, not just living off other people's money. Mom's actually good at the bookkeeping job she got in town. I think she likes having her own income for the first time in years." The transition hadn't been easy for anyone. Richard and Linda had fought the eviction order until the last possible day, hiring lawyers they couldn't afford and making threats they couldn't back up. But faced with the alternative of criminal prosecution, they'd ultimately accepted the inevitable. They'd moved to a small apartment in town, close enough for Emma to maintain a relationship, but far enough away to establish healthy boundaries. "They ask about you sometimes," Emma continued. "Not Dad so much, but Mom. I think she's starting to understand why you made the choices you did." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it might be the beginning of something like understanding. Cathy had learned to be satisfied with small progress, rather than hoping for dramatic transformation. As evening approached, they gathered in the main house's kitchen, a space that felt both familiar and transformed. Mrs. Johnson was there, of course, her presence as much a part of the estate as the old oak trees. She'd officially become the house manager, overseeing maintenance and coordinating with the various contractors and researchers who now used the property as a base for sustainable agriculture studies. "Dinner's almost ready," Mrs. Johnson announced, stirring something that smelled like childhood comfort food. David made his famous cornbread, and Emma brought vegetables from the greenhouse. They ate around the same dining room table where Cathy's world had imploded 3 months earlier, but the conversation was entirely different. Jake talked about his plans for expanding the organic certification program. Emma described her favorite professors and the research opportunities she was exploring. David shared updates from Seattle about cases they were working on together. Environmental law had become their shared practice, with the estate serving as both retreat and laboratory for sustainable living concepts. "I have news," Cathy announced as Mrs. Johnson served her famous apple pie. "The Environmental Law Clinic at University of Oregon wants to partner with us on a land stewardship program. Law students would spend summers here, working on real cases while learning about sustainable agriculture and forest management." The announcement was met with enthusiasm around the table. It represented everything they'd been working toward, a way to honor Nana's legacy while building something new and meaningful. Later, as David helped Mrs. Johnson with dishes and Jake reviewed weather reports for the next day's work, Cathy and Emma walked out to the garden where so much truth had been revealed 3 months earlier. The roses were dormant now, cut back for winter, but Mrs. Johnson had planted mums and asters that glowed like jewels in the gathering dusk. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked quietly. "The way you handled things with Mom and Dad? The choice to prioritize consequences over keeping the family together?" Cathy considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she would have said that family came first, that love meant never having to face the full weight of your actions. Now she understood that real love sometimes required the courage to let people fall far enough to learn how to stand on their own. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that we got to a place where accountability felt like cruelty instead of care. But I don't regret choosing truth over comfort." Emma nodded, her young face thoughtful. "I think Nana would be proud of what you built from what she left you." "What we built," Cathy corrected. "This isn't my estate anymore. It's ours. All of us who chose to be here, to do the work, to build something worth inheriting." As they walked back toward the house, Cathy felt the deep satisfaction that came from hard choices well made. The property was thriving, the family they'd chosen was healthy, and the legacy Nana had entrusted to her was growing into something neither of them could have imagined. The Whitmore estate would remain in family hands, just as Nana had wanted. But the family it belonged to now was defined by shared values and mutual respect, rather than blood relations and inherited obligation. It was a family built on the radical idea that belonging was something you earned through love and integrity, not something you claimed through biology and manipulation. Standing on the front porch where her ordeal had begun, surrounded by people who'd chosen to build something better from the ashes of what came before, Cathy finally understood what home really meant. It wasn't a place you inherited or a relationship you were born into. It was something you created through the daily choice to show up, do the work, and honor the trust that others placed in your hands. The deed in her name had given her legal ownership of 40 acres in Oregon. But the real inheritance, the one that would last, was the knowledge that family was something you built, not something you were stuck with. And sometimes, building something new required the courage to let the old foundations crumble completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.